You would be surprised how good the quality is with an iPhone.
There are things, there's like voiceover in the film, which I used an iPhone for. Like, I would get like a real journalist, when there's a news report, and play it through the radio or whatever, and I would just record it on your phone and send me it. By the time you mucked about with processing it and all the rest of it,
well, yeah, that's the thing.
And it's like coming out of a radio. I mean, you couldn't use it if it were voiceover, but
But you'd be surprised just with the filters and just little, little sweetening of the audio that it sounds great. Welcome to the Film Threat Podcast. Bart Layton, the director of American Animals.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Chris. Thanks for having me. I'm a big fan.
So let's talk about, before we actually talk about American Animals, let's talk about how you got to this place of making this film. Because your resume, at least in early stages, is more of a television background, and television background in reality. And in particular, one show that interested me was the Locked Up Abroad. You have to tell me about this show.
Well, I think like a lot of people who aspire to work in the movies, you do kind of whatever you can to work in visual media or visual arts or, whatever kind of storytelling. And, I'm a huge fan of the radio, for example, and podcasts and all that. So I guess I started out in, when I graduated, I didn't go to film school or anything. I graduated languages, mainly because sort of fascinated by people, and languages are a huge barrier until you speak them, and then that barrier just disappears instantly. And I think I always knew that I wanted to make documentaries, and that then kind of transitioned into wanting to make, scripted or feature films or whatever. In America, there's this division between what's called narrative and what's called doc, and I don't make that distinction, really. I think most good documentaries you'll see are narrative films. I mean, narrative just means story, right? So when I graduated, I applied to every single company which had the word films in the title, and actually got a job at a company that did have the word. It's called September Films. It was in London. They didn't really make films at all. They made really bad TV for the most part. And I kind of worked as a researcher and stuff, and then set up a company with some pals. And what we used to do was really naughty. We used to ring up like commercials companies and stuff, and we'd ask for the show reels, and pretending that we had like a corporate gig or a commercial or a pop video or whatever, and we used to almost re-edit them and pass them off as our own to get jobs as making whatever it was that we were, and along the way we had some ideas for all kinds of shows, mainly documentaries and reality shows, and that was how we kind of got started. And I came up with an idea for like a backpacking race around the world, which was, I think, the first thing that I did, because it was like started on Greenwich Meridian, and the race was basically the first person to get back by hitchhiking 360 degrees around the world. So that was the first thing that sort of took off, and I never had any intention of working in that kind of reality TV. But it was in that time when cameras had just come out where you could be like a one-man producer, director, sound recordist, shooter, everything, and they just brought out these broadcast quality TV cameras. This was like in the early, 2000s or whatever, 2005. Mm-hmm. And that led to me and my partner, Dimitri, who we've run this company, Raw, for about 15 years. We kind of became the guys that you would get to go and shoot in sort of semi-dangerous places. We made documentaries in maximum security prisons. Dimitri was off in war zones. we could go to places where it'd been very difficult to make documentaries before because of, instead of taking 5 people, you just suddenly take 1 person and some extra batteries. And you ask about Locked Up Abroad, that ended up becoming a huge show. We did it as a one-off documentary where I went into a prison in Mexico where I had found the story of a young British couple who they weren't really criminals, they were fairly well educated, and they'd made some very, very naive decisions, and they'd found themselves strapped into anti-narcotic squad bulletproof vests, but all of the Teflon had been taken out of the bulletproof vest and replaced with cocaine. And I was fascinated. It was a friend of mine who was working for the British consulate at the time, and he told me what happened. I was like, wow, there must be an amazing story there somehow of how they made whatever series of decisions, or whatever that first bad decision had been that had left them spiraling into a place of kind of where their lives were no longer in their own control. I was interested in trying to understand that, and obviously Midnight Express had a huge impact on me as a kid. And it was like a real Midnight Express story. And I bought the governor of the prison an mobile air conditioning unit for his office, and then he gave us the run of the prison, and that was pretty extraordinary. And so we did the interviews in there, and then when I was in there, I called my partner Dimitri, and I was like, we could shoot a drama in here if we wanted to. So rather than trying to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars to shoot a drama and build a set and fill it with thousands of extras, we took 2 actors into the prison and we shot the whole thing as you would shoot a documentary. So we had all of the prison guards and all of the prisoners just playing themselves, and we threw these. They weren't even really actors; they were just people who happened to be around. One of them was my researcher. The other one was an English girl that we just happened to find in Mexico, and the effect of it was sort of, I guess it was pre, what Greengrass was doing, which is using this very run and gun documentary aesthetic to drama. And the show, I believe we're now in our 11th season of that show. Wow. And it just took off. It was made as a one-off documentary. It caught on. Someone in the US saw it. I'm sure there's a lot of your listeners who'll be familiar. I've met some really, along the way, I've met some really, well-known people whose names I won't drop, but, I really wanted to talk with them about, my movie. And they had somehow got wind of the fact that I created this show, Locked Up Abroad, and that's all they wanted to talk about. I am addicted to that show, so... And now they have marathons of it. It's a sort of entered the public kind of consciousness somehow. So that enabled us to grow a business, and then what we do is we tend to try and use all of the resources that we make from doing the TV stuff to divert into everything starts as a passion project, and then it gets to a stage where there are other brilliant up-and-coming directors who will do it. We make all of those shows as if they're like guerrilla films. And often the budgets for a single cable TV show is higher than, an independent film.
Right.
So we use that as a vehicle for getting, directors who come from, genre backgrounds or anything, and, who want to step into drama, and that's how that works.
So at any point when you were doing that show or some of these other shows, did you feel your life was in danger? These sound like horrifying. I spent the night in a Detroit jail once, and that was frightening enough. So I can't imagine what it's like. How do you, you bought this air conditioner to kind of sweeten the pot and get the run of this prison to shoot that kind of pilot episode, but you must have just felt in danger at some point. It had to be kind of scary.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I think, listen, this isn't, war photography or war reporting, but you are in some very dangerous places, and the last thing you should do is take security. Everyone's like, well, don't you take security with you? But as soon as you take security into, either a favela or a shanty town or a prison, it's like you're saying to the people who actually live there, we don't trust you. We don't trust you not to rob us or, kidnap us or whatever. So I guess that's where, my languages came in. I'm bilingual, I speak Spanish. And so once you go into the prison, you then have to get the permission of the different gangs and the gang leaders, because most of the blocks in the prison are run by different gangs. And then you go and approach them and you say, explain what your intentions are and what you're doing. And once you get the kind of the main guy on board, then everything else follows. And you can't take anything in. We were allowed to take cigarettes and like Coca-Cola, and that's what we kind of paid them for, and you paid them with. But I guess it's really intimidating until such a time as you win their respect, and then it's this extraordinary experience of making a film within a real setting, but everyone is sort of playing along with you. Yeah.
So do you think part of their cooperation has to do with the potential celebrity of being on television, and so they're maybe more amenable to what you'd like to do?
I think there is that thing of, a lot of the people who find themselves in these situations, in prisons, and I'm not, and some of them are very bad people and they absolutely deserve to be there, but a lot of them have been monumentally starved of any kind of attention throughout their whole lives. No one's really given a shit about them. And so as soon as someone comes and takes an interest, a lot of what happens to people, and this is something you see in documentaries a lot, is people who are very inarticulate. As soon as you give them the opportunity and you take an interest in them, they like blossom in front of you. And I think probably that's a part of it. And if you're in prison, you tend to have a lot of time on your hands, and everything is the same day after day. And I think they were grateful for the distraction. And that really was I guess the first time that people had done drama documentary in that way. It feels very dated now, but back when we started doing it, 10 years ago, it was a new thing. You hadn't seen dramatization that felt as visceral as that. And I guess it's sort of spawned a lot of other things that have come from it.
Well, what's interesting about Locked Up Abroad is you could probably watch a marathon of it while you're locked up.
Yeah, I wonder how that would feel, but yes, you probably could, I guess. Yeah.
So those early experiences, and especially working in television, which I think is, I really think some of the best filmmakers I've ever met are people who started in TV, because it's really like exercising and just working those creative storytelling muscles and applying that to film later. It almost makes making a film seem easier with just the constant struggles of outputting hours and hours and hours of content, hundreds of hours of content of television. So are there lessons that you took from your TV experiences that you brought into now your feature films? I mean, starting with The Imposter, and I think it was 2012, and then American Animals?
Certainly, with The Imposter, I think the thing is that you learn to sort of, make use of whatever resources are available to you. And the whole thing with those shows was that we just didn't have enough money to do the scale of what we wanted to. So instead of trying to make a kind of mini movie on a documentary budget, you just make a virtue of that and you shoot in a very kind of guerrilla way, and and you do things that actually you can't really do on a proper film shoot. So I found the transition from that kind of work to working on a union DGA film where everything is very you're very limited by how kind of creative or how much stuff you can steal. And with The Imposter, with things like that, we would just steal stuff. I mean, you'd point the camera out of the car window, or you tell the actors to just jump out and run along here. We're going to track with you. We're going to, you do sort of all sorts of things that people in independent film will be familiar with. But I think once you get into more well-known actors and a more kind of conventional movie setup, you can't do that. You can't. There was a scene we shot in New York, and it was just and I just wanted it to be a point of view shot out of the window, and you see all of the kind of life and color and diversity of New York. And I figured that we'll just literally do that. We'll go around the block a few times and we'll point the camera. But we couldn't do that because, there's SAG, there's, all of the different unions that were good. So we actually had to cast all of the extras to be walking in the street, which just blew my mind.
Well, I'm told that actually if you just put up signs in a particular area and you say that if you walk in this area, you may be on camera, that's something you can get away with. I heard that from the director of, it was that Denzel Washington movie, Raymond J. Israel Esquire. If you just put up signs in the area, you can just shoot it, and that's a way to get away with it. I think those guerrilla techniques are great, but I think it also depends on how I guess maybe paranoid the legal department is, to whoever the purchase.
It's got a big part to play in it. I guess it's just the difference between with doc work, you can just be much more spontaneous. You can kind of adapt and change things on the day, and there's a lot less freedom to do that. You have to be a lot more kind of buttoned up in terms of what the plan is. And so that for me was a big learning curve, going from an environment where I was used to just kind of running around with a small gang and getting in a minibus and deciding to change plans at the last minute or whatever it is, to moving with a big crew and trailers and trucks and all of that. That's it's a tricky transition to make, one that I ended up really enjoying, because you also get the benefit of a huge amount of expertise and crew and all of the amazing people that come with that. But it's a very different thing.
Well, let's talk about what brought you to American Animals. It's, first of all, based on a real story of 4 kids in Kentucky that plan a heist to steal a valuable book, sell it for a lot of money, and it's a true story, happened in 2004. How did you even come across this story?
So, well, again, partly because of the, having the company and doing the amount of, TV stuff we do, we're constantly looking for stories that, and you don't know whether they're going to be feature docs or TV shows or feature films. And this was one of them that I found, the news cuttings, and then there was a brilliant article written in Vanity Fair, and there were a whole load of kind of press cuttings that I guess I was intrigued by. And the thing that was intriguing to me initially was the fact that it wasn't your usual suspects. This was a group of young men who were pretty well educated. They came from supposedly very good homes. They had been given a lot of opportunities. They were all regarded as, good kids, essentially. Mm-hmm. And, not the kind of people that normally end up in prison, in federal prison for, a hugely audacious art heist. So I guess my first question was just, wanting to understand a bit of the why of it. Why had they done it, and what did they ever imagine for a second that they could have got away with it? And if they did, what did they imagine their lives were going to be like? Were they going to, with suddenly millions of dollars? It all just, none of it quite added up. And so, coming from docs, the first thing I did was just start writing to them in prison, and explaining who I was, and I have a great producing partner called Poppy, who worked on The Imposter with me, and and that's what we do in the doc world, is you kind of go to the horse's mouth. And I didn't know what the film was going to be, and then when we made contact, it turned out that there was a big Hollywood producer who'd paid a fortune for the life rights, so it looked like there wasn't going to be a story. But I was still curious enough to want to understand a bit more of their motivation, and that's where we started this kind of relationship. And I guess it was what came back from them in the letters that was the thing that turned it from being, a fun and interesting story into a real story of our time, and the things that they put in their letters were things, were incredibly honest about, one of them, who's the lead character, talked about always having dreamt of becoming an artist, but felt that his life was so devoid of anything. He read about all the great artists that ever lived, and the one thing that they all had in common was that they'd suffered, that they had life experience, that they'd seen and done things, and he felt his life was too devoid of that, and that he wasn't likely to come across anything that was going to give him an experience worth making art about. And I thought, wow, that's such an extraordinary idea, that your life is almost too perfect, and that his main problem was that he didn't have a problem. And then the others talked about, a desire to kind of throw this sort of suburban treadmill away, and, and try and, so to me, a lot of what they talked about was this desperate need to find an identity, and, being brought up on an expectation that their lives were going to be interesting, that they were going to be special. And that felt to me like a very relevant thing, particularly, as we live in a world where, there's an increasing pressure to be remarkable in some way. How many Instagram followers have you got? How much, that now there's a real premium on, and there's a way in which you can almost measure how noteworthy you are, how many people are interested in who you are, and I think that was also part of the motivation for what they did. And so the more detail I got on the crime and the more detail I got on them, the more fascinating the story became, and how misguided this kind of quest to find an identity. It was like an existential experiment they conducted. They got to a place where I think they arrived at a crossroads. Initially, I think the whole thing started as a kind of fantasy. It started as a joke. I don't think they ever intended to go through with it.
Well, do you think in some way they may have been influenced by heist films? I mean, heist films is a very popular genre. There's all types. There's heist films where just trying to steal the money. Heat, I think, is probably one of the most widely known heist films. But I think when you're pulling off a heist where you're stealing, rare art, rare books, paintings, I mean, that it's a different kind of, it's a person who actually appreciates art, which is odd. Do you think in some way they were influenced by those types of films and sort of the romanticizing of that kind of criminal behavior?
Yeah, I mean, I think you see that in the movie. I mean, he, one of the characters even, points out the fact, there aren't books on how you plan a robbery. So the only thing they know, in terms of how to kind of get some sense of how to pull off a heist, especially one as elaborate as this, is you watch all the movies You watch all of that, you know, they go to Blockbusters and they rent every heist movie. That's what they actually did in real life. And, you know, the irony is that most of those movies don't end terribly well. But anyway, you know, so definitely I think that was the whole thing, that they start off trying to inhabit a kind of movie version of their lives. You know, they even, you know, the real guys even described it as a kind of, as their version of Fight Club. You know, it was this thing that gave them an escape, you know, that set them apart from everyone else who was just kind of continuing with, you know, the status quo. And then what happens is the fantasy is allowed to go way too far. And before they know it, they've crossed a line they should never have crossed, and they can't cross back. So, yeah, I think a lot of what it was about was this idea of kind of falling into a fantasy and then thinking that, you know, something's going to happen that's going to prevent them actually from going through with it. And that obstacle never quite appears, and before they know it, the whole thing has gone too far.
I mean, we've seen so many great heist films in the past, but we've never, ever seen a heist film told this way. I mean, it is, and you mentioned before, documentary narrative. A lot of people draw that line. I think, I guess maybe the distinction is you're using the real people in the documentary, although, you know, in a movie like Private Parts with Howard Stern, they just cast Howard Stern to play himself. So is that documentary? Is that narrative? Whatever. It's, you know, if it's a good story, it's a good story. But in this, you use the real people talking about their lives and themselves mixed with actors that you've cast to play them. I know that there have been, this started to be a trend where I was keeping track of them. I made a list of movies about real life people that then at the end of the film, this is a little button that they do. It's in I, Tonya, it's in The Disaster Artist, it's in the movie Sully. And it started to be a trend where there's actually a long list of, it's a, you know, story about a real life person that ends with footage of the real person. It kind of got to actually be a bit, I thought it was a little lazy, creatively speaking, for some of these films.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, but the way you've done it is these interviews to camera, you know, looking into the camera, that's, you know, which is really the piercing. You're seeing that person and telling their side of what happened, and not all the information adds up. There are different versions of the truth, which I found fascinating. And so was that something that you determined from the beginning, or did you start making a documentary and say this is something different, or was this choice, because you wrote the screenplay to accompany this, so what led to the choice to do it this way?
Well, I think, you know, I want to be really clear, it's not in any shape or form a documentary. You know, it's a narrative, scripted movie. It's, but, you know, I think with I, Tonya, you saw, and, you know, films like To Die For, you know, they use actors in kind of interview situations. Mm-hmm. And I think that can be effective. But for me, with this, I wanted to explore the idea that there's maybe a new way of telling a true story that you haven't quite seen before. And part of that is, you know, this idea that you involve the real people in a way that kind of mirrors the descent into, from kind of reality into fantasy, you know, that we start in a place which you recognize as being sort of naturalistic, and then as the movie progresses, we fall into something that feels more like a heist movie. That, you know, the tropes of that feel like, you know, and I think if you're going to make a heist movie, you have to embrace those. But also, I wanted to completely kind of turn it on its head. You know, we've all seen those movies where it starts with based on a true story, and then we see the famous actors playing the real people, and we go along with it because that's the contract we're willing to make. We're happy to watch Natalie Portman play Jackie, you know. And I sort of felt like, well, what if there's another way of thinking about it where you don't encourage the audience to suspend disbelief. Instead, by using the real people, you're constantly reminded that this is real. The story is so far-fetched. What happens is so kind of insane. But you never lose sight of the fact that the people are real, the story is real, and the consequences are real. So you, as an audience, have more emotional engagement in the story. And I think that, if the audiences that we've played the film to so far here and at Sundance are anything to go by, people find the film hugely kind of, suspenseful, incredibly difficult to watch at times because of the tension, and incredibly gripping because I think at no point are you lost in a movie. You're like, holy shit, this has really happened, and you're desperate to know where it's going to go because, most of us aren't either foolish enough or daring enough or stupid enough to cross the line that you should never cross, and so, the intention with this was to make something that was bigger than the sum of its parts. If someone pulls a gun out in a documentary, that is a heart-stopping moment. Mm-hmm. But in movies, people get shot in the face every 5 minutes, and you kind of don't bat an eyelid. Whereas I think, I hope that the effect of this is you just engage with it in a very different way. It becomes a more emotionally powerful story because of your connection with those real guys. And 95% of the film is these brilliant actors inhabiting this movie, and then there's 5% which is the non-fiction stuff.
Right.
I mean, you're probably better equipped to tell me how effective that is, but I think
it was incredibly effective because I'm not familiar with the actual case. I didn't know, did they get away with it? Did they pay for this crime? What was going to happen? So for me, it just added, and I think we're here in Austin, Texas for South by Southwest, where it's screened here to an audience. The audience at the Paramount, I mean, there are moments where you could hear a pin drop. I mean, that were, those moments where they, you see the real Spencer, the real Warren, and I mean, there are moments where they actually they're emotionally hold it 100% together that were incredible. It was gripping. I mean, it's just, I've never seen a film this way. I mean, it's like, I guess the closest thing is maybe, like the way you started is you do these recreations, and that's a popular on news channels. It's a recreation, you're interviewing the person, but it's not, this is done in a completely, totally different way that I think just, it really worked for me. I don't, I can't speak for everyone else in the world, but I feel like everyone at that screening was blown away.
Yeah, I was really happy with the audience reaction. I mean, they seem that, it seems to be universally that, there's a lot of laughs at the beginning, there's a lot of excitement, and there's a lot of fun, and then there's a place where it just becomes incredibly, suspenseful, and that was the intention, that you kind of get not one movie which has one tone throughout, you get kind of 2 or 3 different ones. And I hope there's a kind of a balance between stuff that feels comedic and kind of sort of action orientated, and stuff that feels kind of poignant and emotionally challenging. There's an interesting thing, this question of like what is reenactment and what is recreation. Obviously, I'm not a fan of those terms, mm-hmm. but it's interesting how you could argue that any feature film which is based on a true story is a reenactment. I mean, like you talked about Sully. I mean, I guess that whole thing is a reenactment. Right. But it's interesting how as soon as you put real people in, people talk about it in terms of recreation and reenactment. Whereas if you don't put them in until, as you point out, everyone does it at the end, we see the little photos of everyone and all the rest of it, then people describe that as a narrative feature based on a true story.
Right.
So I'm not quite sure. I think, in this film we've got Evan Peters, we've got Barry Keoghan, we've got probably, I think, arguably the best actors of their generation, right?
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to ask you about the casting. I mean, Barry and Evan are incredible in the film. I mean, it's mostly focused on their characters or their real life counterparts, I guess. So how did you find them? I mean, and Evan I spoke to, I actually went to your party at Sundance. I was there at the Grey Goose Lounge.
Oh,
they were serving.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, you were there. I think they were taking pictures of you as you walked in, and had a really interesting conversation with Evan Peters about just he's the type of actor that he just commits to it. He just goes for it. I'm talking about just other roles I've seen him in, and then I mean, he's incredible. So how did you get to Barry and Evan? How did you get in casting them? How did that work?
Well, I had an amazing casting director called Avi Kaufman, who is, she's like one of the top in the industry, and the combination of, basically the process is just, has to be, don't stop casting until you find the very best actors for the role. There was a point where we could have cast some much bigger names. We had the script attracted, I'm not going to name them, but when you think about who are the most famous of that age group, which is, I guess, 25 to 35 or whatever, we had the potential to cast the starriest of that group, but to my mind, they all kind of looked like familiar movie stars. They looked like people who, just didn't feel authentic to me in the same way. And I think when when Evan auditioned, it was like, all right, well, that's it. Call off the search, right? Right. Same with Barry, same with Jared, and also Blake. They just were so unique. It was really important when you put an ensemble together, you want to have 3 or 4 or 5 or however many of the characters. They need to be really distinct individuals. There can't be too much overlap, either physically in terms of their look or in terms of character-wise. You want people who are really distinct. You think about all of those great movies, which are ensemble parts. They're each of the characters is very different. Their motivation is different. Their character, you've got someone who's shy, you've got someone who's extrovert, you've got someone who's, OCD, you've got someone, there's all, there has to be that sort of distinction. And I think also I didn't want super familiar faces. And, there was a point where I think the financiers were quite keen on the idea that we had, the option of casting these really well-known guys, but at the same time they were amazing in supporting me in saying I don't want that. I want people who don't bring a lot of baggage to it, and they don't look like these kind of Hollywood pretty boys. They look like real people, and and that extended to everything we did. Whether it was wardrobe, whether it was makeup, whether we wanted it to feel real, I guess. And you're right about Evan. He is he's virtually a method actor. He is so professional. He is so focused. He didn't stay in character for 3 months, but he almost did. He was so serious, whereas Barry comes from kind of the opposite end. He is, he's from the mean streets of Dublin. He is untrained, and what he does just comes from the heart. He has to be in the moment, and he's not prepared in the way that Evan is, but what he does is he turns up and he kind of just inhabits that moment in that scene, and what he does is kind of extraordinary.
Yeah, I was blown away by Barry in the sense that I didn't know that he was faking an American accent until he spoke at the Q&A. It's there's something about Brits that play that American accent. They're very good at it. It's shocking.
Yeah, the sound recordist on our shoot, because the thing is Barry will. He's got the thickest Irish accent you will ever hear, but he stayed in, because obviously between takes and what have you, you don't want to be switching in and out, but he stayed kind of not in character, but in American throughout most of the shoot. And at the end, when he suddenly started speaking this like unbelievable, deep, like almost incomprehensible Irish accent, the sound recordist was just like had no idea that he wasn't American. Wow. That's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, well, it's the American accent is the least sexy accent, I think, in the world.
Well, you're only saying that because as an American, it's just about how exotic it is.
I guess, I don't know. Are American accents popular overseas?
Well, yours is very sexy.
Thank you for saying so. So what were some of the... and there's some amazing moments in it. One of the things that struck me was their idea to dress up as older men, because people don't notice older men, right? They want to be like old guys. We're just going to be nondescript old guys with wigs. We're going to make ourselves look... first of all, I can't believe that they thought that this was a good idea and went to and then seeing it pulled off in the film, it's kind of ridiculous in a way. I just want to get your comments on that and just how fun that was to do, because if I recall correctly, the film opens with, Warren, played by Evan Peters, putting on this makeup.
Yeah.
You're wondering, what is he doing?
Well, I don't want to give too much away, but
right.
Yeah, listen, you'd have to. That wasn't something that I invented for the screenplay. That was something that they really did.
Right.
And it was. Spencer has a line in the film where they're discussing, why, one of them is like, well, why the fuck would we go as old men? And Spencer's line is, well, being old is the next closest thing to being invisible. And, in a way, it's kind of a throwaway line, but it's also like, I guess I wrote it because, there is something about, particularly in our culture, as you get older, you become less relevant and less important, somehow old people are kind of, I don't know, they're ignored at a certain point. And I think part of their idea was, a group of old men is not going to be a threatening sight. Most people are not going to be worried about. They're not going to present a security risk. So that was, I think, why they hit on that idea for that disguise. That it's the least threatening, and that old people can kind of pass, especially as where the heist takes place. It's in, it's kind of a library with an art museum inside it. A special collections room, and. That is a place where, despite it being within a university, it's not uncommon to see, elderly people looking at works of art and all the rest of it. So I think that was the thinking. Whether they thought that they were going to be able to do the prosthetics and all the rest of it successfully enough to pass themselves off, I don't. But I also think it comes down to this thing that we were talking about the fantasy. What they were really in love with was being in a movie. Where you do all the things that you do, and you create really elaborate disguises, you plan it all. That, I think they were more kind of in love with that idea than the reality of thinking that they were going to get away with it and they were going to do it. So, and I don't want to give too much away about what happened, but I just don't think they anticipated that they were going to get away with it, and that, anyway, there's a whole load of, it goes to a lot of, there's a few twists where the movie goes to places you never quite think it's going to go to.
Right, and obviously, I don't want to talk about the ending or how it all turns out. But if you are listening to this and you have not seen the film yet, we might talk about a little bit of spoilery stuff in this last part. I have a couple questions, so you might want to pause this. Make sure you go out and see American Animals. But there's one of the things that I think one of the most harrowing moments is the librarian, the one when they come in and that actually ends up being a big part of the plan, is that like no one wants anything to do with hurting anybody.
Yeah.
And that's I think a huge tension moment. So can you talk about what went into that and like how, like, I mean, that I just thought was another moment where you could hear a pin drop. I mean, I thought something horrifying was about to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that was all very intentional. I mean, they get to a place where, in the planning of the heist, they sort of forget that there is a human being who is standing between them and the artwork that they want to take. And, in their minds, it's going to be like Ocean's 11. There's no victims, no one's going to get hurt. But in reality, when you actually set out to commit the crime, there is a living, breathing human being, and in this case, a kind of middle-aged woman played by the amazing Ann Dowd, who is just like, she's just so extraordinary. That was where we talk about the line that you should never cross, particularly, people with the opportunities that they had, coming from the backgrounds they had, the last thing anyone would ever expect from them is that they would commit a violent crime. No history of any of that. No, and I think where the whole, and again, I don't want to, spoil it, but, where the movie goes to is there's a point where we as an audience are kind of almost complicit. We've been invited to become a member of this gang. We've been invited in, and we also want to kind of know what's going to happen. We need to have this experience, this vicarious experience where we're suddenly part of a kind of Ocean's 11 type team, and we are invited to. We're almost like rooting for them to do it, but at the same time, we're desperately screaming at the screen, please don't go through with this because it can't end well. And so there was a very intentional point for me where I wanted I wanted to take the audience into movie world. So if you look at the film, the grammar of the movie starts to shift. It starts in kind of naturalism. It's handheld, a lot of it to begin with, and then slowly it gets slicker. There's much more Steadicam. There's much more stuff which is on track. The color and the look of we introduce colors that you haven't seen earlier in the film. It all becomes glossier, and it becomes kind of, I guess, closer to, the heist movies that we're familiar with. And then there's this moment where we pull the rug out from both the characters, but also from us, the audience, and you're like left kind of falling off the edge of a cliff in a way with them, desperately trying to get out of a bad situation.
And there's another part of the film that I guess maybe some might think it's just a throwaway. I thought it was incredibly impactful, and that's where Barry as Spencer sees Spencer. They're driving in the car, and he kind of sees the real Spencer.
Yeah.
And it's almost like he's saying, trying to communicate with the movie version of himself.
Yeah.
And you don't realize necessarily who that. I thought that was so powerful, and it's those moments I think in films that I think are underappreciated, which is characters thinking. In the original Godfather, when Michael Corleone, Al Pacino's like, he's considering, committing this crime that will change his life forever. This is a different path, and you see the tension moment is him thinking. And I think even Luke Skywalker looking out over the twin suns of Tatooine. It's a great moment with, it's not a special effects driven moment. It's a character thinking. I think that those are, whenever I notice that a director has, chosen to include that kind of moment, that's just something that I find just really compelling. So I don't know if I have a question, just a comment that I think that was very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of points where where the intent, I guess the difference from, for me was I didn't want you watching the film in the way that you're like, there's, we all know there's a load of films that you kind of watch and there's a bunch of films which you participate in. You're like in it. You are living it with them. And so that was really the intention. And it comes back to the question you asked at the beginning about why this particular kind of form of storytelling. And I think it the only way I can answer that is because, I want you to participate. I want you to feel what they're feeling, because we've all been in a situation where you're kind of going along with something and you shouldn't, and there's a point where you want to pull the ripcord, and most of us will get to that place and we will say, enough. Mm-hmm. And the moment that you're talking about is probably that moment where Spencer should say, that's it, game over, enough, I'm out. And for whatever reason, and I think that reason is because of his need, that character's need to have a meaningful life experience, something that's going to change his life. He doesn't know whether it's going to change it for the better or for the worse, but he feels that he needs something that's just going to irreversibly change it. And so he chooses, not to stop. And that moment that you're talking about, I guess, is where you've almost got, the actor passes the real character in the kind of fictional movie space. And I guess it's sort of like the Ghost of Christmas Future or whatever it is, it's an omen, and he doesn't quite know how to read it. But yeah, no, I'm glad you picked up on that. Yeah, I felt that it was, a kind of, I guess, a poignant moment.
Was that something that was scripted, or something like, oh, let's try this, or let's combine these shots?
Yeah, everything was scripted, and there were a lot of things in the script where, there was a kind of, well, let's try this because it hasn't been done before. You've got no way of knowing whether it's going to work, and I guess that would be one of the things that I came away with, and that would be a piece of advice I would probably give to other filmmakers, is that thing that you've written on the page that you really don't know whether it's going to work or not. And on the day when you're running out of time, it's sort of easy to go, well, let's not do that because I just don't know whether that's going to work. You have to do it because it's the only way you'll know. And I would say 9 times out of 10, it will work. Possibly even better than you thought it would. So, yeah, I mean, everything was scripted. The screenplay was really, no one had really read a screenplay like that, so there wasn't really a template for that. People didn't know what to make of it. They didn't know how to schedule it. So, I definitely could have picked an easier first narrative for sure, and my life probably would have been a little less stressful, but I'm glad because, those things which feel like experiments, those are the things that, you can feel like you're breaking new ground or, and I think whether you fail, at least you failed doing something that you felt passionately was worth trying, I guess,
Did you, in the production, did you shoot the interviews first and then...
Yeah. Well, actually, I wrote the screenplay based on the letters they sent me from prison. And then when they finally came out of prison, we did the interviews. But when we shot the interviews, they didn't say the things I had written. I wrote, because I couldn't get the movie financed without the screenplay. I couldn't really write the screenplay without having shot the interviews, but I couldn't shoot the interviews without the screenplay. So it was this really weird catch-22 thing. So what I did was I wrote into the script the things they had said in their letters, and which I expected them to say when we sat down and shot the interviews. But of course they didn't. They said other things that were different or better or worse, and actually some of the stuff that came up was a lot darker than I had anticipated. So then after we shot those interviews, I had to say to the producers and financiers, I was like, you need to let me kind of pause production. Like literally, can we press pause and let me rewrite the script for a month or two? Which you never do when you're in production.
Right.
And fortunately, they could understand the need to do it, and they saw the value in doing that. So I went back and I wrote into the script exactly what the real guys had said in those interviews, and that was then woven back into the script.
So you pre-cut those sequences so that you knew exactly what you were cutting, because there's so many great moments of contrasting or complementing a thing that's happening or explaining something. I guess one of the most interesting things is the idea, did Warren actually go on that trip overseas to meet with this art collector played by Udo Kier? What is because there's really there's not a straight answer to that question.
There really isn't. I mean, that is a major spoiler. So if you haven't seen the film, best to kind of come back to this
the
question.
Spoiler warning was given. So
yeah, you're right. Listen, I don't know. I mean, I don't have any more information than you do.
Wow.
I have my own personal theory, but I have, either way, Warren is going to stick to his story till the bitter end. Mm-hmm. And, Warren is with Warren, you don't know. I mean, I have no, my experience of him has been one of complete honesty. Mm-hmm. And, he is a charismatic, magnetic, deeply likable person who I'm incredibly fond of. But, he's also someone who is an amazing storyteller and a fantasist. And that's part of who he is. And so I couldn't tell you, I think that's just something that audiences are going to have to make their own minds up about.
Wow. Well, I love that term, fantasist. I think that I have not heard that.
Really?
No, not used that way. No, a fantasist. The audience here in Austin for South by love the film. What's the most surprising question that you've heard from the Q&As? Because I think,
someone put up their hand and said, is this a true story? And I was like, oh, what? Hang on a minute. Like, it's really, you've got the real guys in it. Yeah. And I think people thought that the real guys are also actors.
Oh.
And that surprised me, because it says really clearly, the real Spencer Reinhardt, the real one. But I suppose it's because the story is so much stranger than fiction that people assume that it can't be true. And, we had that with The Imposter, which The Imposter was really a documentary, even though it was a hybrid. And again, because the story is so outlandish, that I guess you kind of can't believe that it really happened. I guess people would ask, is it based on a true story? And I was like, you just watched the documentary. So, with this, I was also surprised that people didn't realize that the real guys were the real guys.
And one final question.
Sure.
Is your closest friend from childhood is about to make their first feature film.
Uh-huh.
What one piece of advice do you tell your friend?
Well, one piece of advice. I think there's one thing which is about, how do you start? And my advice with that is you just have to sit down and put pen to paper or start typing, by final draft, whatever it is. And because once you start, there's this expression, I can't remember who it is, but it's like, be bold and great forces will come to your aid. And I think that is true. The biggest obstacle to writing a screenplay or making a movie is writing a screenplay, is just starting, and it's amazing that once you do start, these characters that you created, they start to have their own personalities, and they start to live and breathe and and interact, and they will help you. Your characters will help you along the way. So that would be the other piece of advice. And I think the other thing is, just don't let anyone tell you that there is one way of doing things, that it has to be done in a certain way, that you can't fuck with the form, that you can't mix non-fiction and fiction, that you can't shoot something as, that's just not true. There are no real rules, and part of the fun is breaking that. And once you get into an edit suite, you realize that there really is no single way in which a scene should be shot or a story should be told. There are conventions, and I think it's really helpful to know what those are. Mm-hmm. But I think, don't let anyone tell you that there were a few people who said, I don't think that screenplay you've written where you mix these two, fiction and non-fiction, I don't think that's going to work. You're going to have to decide one or other. It's like, nah, I don't think so. I think it can, it work. You never know until you get there, but I think you just have to, pursue your vision and try not to let people dampen it somehow.
Great. Bart Layton, thanks for talking to me on the Film Threat podcast.
Oh, listen, it's such a pleasure. I wish I'd had a bit more sleep the night before.
That's okay.
It's been great, and I love your podcast.
Oh, thank you. South by Southwest will do that to you. So that's crazy. All right, let's get out of here.
I don't want you waking up years from now wondering what could have happened and who you could have been.
Are you sure you're okay?
Oh, this is my life. This isn't some game.
Can you please not touch the model?